Snow had been falling over Sudbury since before sunrise, and Adrian Kowalski hadn't slept. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark, the glow of his laptop the only light in the apartment, a half-empty mug of cold coffee beside his elbow. On the screen was an email he had written and deleted 4 times already. His daughter Zoe was still asleep in the next room. She was 7 years old and had no idea that her father had been carrying this particular weight for the last 3 weeks. Ever since Dr. Pemberton sat across from them both in that small beige office at Health Sciences North and said the words, moderate to severe scoliosis, like he was reading from a grocery list. The surgery was not optional. Not anymore. The curve in Zoe's spine had progressed faster than anyone expected, and without the procedure, the damage to her lungs would become permanent within 2 years. Problem wasn't the surgery, the problem was what came after it. 6 weeks of recovery minimum. Possibly 8. She would need someone home with her full time. She would need physio appointments 3 times a week. She would need her father, not a shift supervisor racing between work sites at 6 in the morning. Adrian worked for Norwood Structural, a mid-size industrial contractor based out of Sudbury. He had been with them for 11 years. Longer than his marriage had lasted. Longer than Zoe had been alive. He was good at his job. He was the kind of worker managers called first when something went sideways on a site, and he had taken a quiet pride in that for a long time. But the company ran on rigid schedules and unforgiving timelines, and his manager, a stocky man named Don, had already made his position clear when Adrian brought it up 2 weeks earlier. I can't hold your position for 2 months, Kowalski. That's not how this works. Adrian had nodded and said he understood. He had driven home in silence, and then sat in the parking lot of his building for 20 minutes before going upstairs. Because he didn't want Zoe to see his face until he could put it back together properly. He'd spent the weeks since trying to find a middle path, a leave of absence, a partial arrangement, anything that would let him keep the job and be there for his daughter. Don had refused all of it. The company's insurance wouldn't cover an extended personal leave, without triggering a probationary review, which would almost certainly end in termination anyway. The union rep had been sympathetic but honest. The collective agreement wasn't designed for situations like his. So now Adrian sat in his dark kitchen at 5:40 in the morning, staring at the resignation letter he had written for the 5th time. And this time he didn't delete it. He read it once. He read it again. Then he pressed send before his hands could stop him. He closed the laptop and sat there in the silence for a long time, listening to the wind outside and the occasional creak of the building settling into the cold. He felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not panic, not relief exactly. Just a strange hollow stillness, like the moment after a tree falls. Zoe padded out at 7:15 in her sock feet, her dark hair still tangled from sleep, dragging a stuffed moose she'd had since she was 3. She looked at him curiously. You didn't make oatmeal, she said. Not yet, he said. Come here. She climbed into his lap without question, which is something only small children do, and he held her tighter than usual. She let him, without asking why. Is today a work day? She asked. Not anymore, he said. She seemed to accept this as straightforwardly as she accepted most things. She pressed her face against his shoulder and went quiet, and Adrian looked out the window at the snow still falling, over the city, and told himself he had made the right choice. He told himself that several more times over the following weeks. With decreasing conviction, the first month was hard in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. He had savings. Not much, but enough to cover rent and food for about 2 months if he was careful. He canceled his internet plan and switched to a cheaper phone package. He stopped buying coffee and started making it at home, then stopped buying the good coffee, and started buying the cheap kind that tasted like hot cardboard. He sold the spare snow tires sitting in his storage unit, then the old compound bow he hadn't touched in 4 years. He told himself these were just things. Zoe's surgery was scheduled for the 3rd week of February. The procedure itself went well. 6 hours. A titanium rod along the length of her spine. A surgeon named Dr. Okonkwo, who shook Adrian's hand afterward and told him his daughter was remarkably calm for a 7-year-old. Adrian had laughed, a little too loudly, in the way people laugh when they've been sitting in a waiting room for 6 hours running worst-case scenarios on a loop. The recovery was slower than anyone had prepared him for. Zoe was brave in a way that broke something open in his chest. She endured the physio exercises with a set jaw and did not complain, even on the mornings when he could see it hurt. But she was exhausted for weeks, and there were days when she just needed him to be there, sitting beside her, reading out loud from the library books he brought home in stacks because the library was free and the books made her happy. He read to her every afternoon. He learned to make her favorite soup, chicken and wild rice. from a recipe on the back of a can, then learned to make it better from memory. He walked her slowly around the block 3 times a week. When she was strong enough, the two of them bundled up against the March cold, Zoe gripping his arm and narrating everything she saw with the seriousness of a documentary host. "That dog is wearing a coat," she would say. "I think he feels embarrassed." "Probably," Adrian would say. "I would feel embarrassed if you put a coat on me. You're wearing a coat right now. That's different. I chose it." These were the moments that kept him from losing his mind entirely. But the fear underneath them never went away. By late March, he had 6 weeks left of savings. He had applied for employment insurance. But the application was delayed because his departure had been classified as a voluntary quit, which triggered a review. The process would take weeks more. A neighbor, a retired woman named Frances who sometimes watched Zoe when Adrian needed to run errands, had quietly left a bag of groceries outside his door one evening. He had stood in the hallway, holding it for a long moment before bringing it inside. He had not been able to bring himself to knock on her door and thank her properly, because he hadn't trusted his voice. He applied for jobs online in the evenings after Zoe went to sleep. Most of them required availability he didn't have yet. A few called back. None of them could wait until Zoe was cleared to go back to school. He was running out of time in the specific, concrete way that people with no cushion run out of time. Not as a metaphor, but as a fact on a spreadsheet, a number going down, a date getting closer. One evening in early April, Zoe was sitting at the kitchen table doing a puzzle, a map of Canada she'd gotten at Christmas. And she looked up at him with a question that had clearly been sitting in her for a while. "Dad," she said, "do we have enough?" He looked at her. She was 7, and she had picked up more than he'd thought. "We'll be okay," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than a 7-year-old usually would, and then looked back down at her puzzle. She found the piece from Manitoba and set it in place carefully. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew." Adrian excused himself and went to stand in the bathroom for a few minutes, with the door closed and the fan running. He didn't let himself stay there long. He splashed cold water on his face, dried it off, and went back out to help her find Quebec. Lights in the hallway of their building had been flickering for a week. On the second Thursday in April, they went out entirely while Adrian was coming back from the grocery store. He felt his way up the stairs in the dark, one hand on the wall, a canvas bag cutting into his palm. He was thinking about how he was going to stretch the chicken he'd bought into 3 separate dinners when he reached the landing, and saw, in the dim light from the street lamp, coming through the hall window, that someone was standing outside his apartment door. He stopped. The woman standing there was tall, wearing a long gray coat, her silver hair cut very short. She had the bearing of someone who spent her life walking into rooms first. Beside her stood a teenage boy, maybe 15, hands in the pockets of his jacket, looking at the floor. Adrian didn't recognize her. He thought for a half-second that she had the wrong door. Then she looked up and said, "Adrian Kowalski?" "Yes," he said slowly. "My name is Catherine Norwood," she said. "I'm the founder of Norwood Structural." The name landed differently than he expected. He had worked for the company for 11 years and had never once seen the woman who built it. She had stepped back from daily operations years ago. Don reported to a regional VP. The founder was a name at the top of a letterhead, a framed photo in the lobby of the head office in Sudbury, that he'd walked past 100 times without thinking much about it. He stood in the hall holding his grocery bag, unable to think of a single appropriate thing to say. "You came here," he said finally. It wasn't quite a sentence. "I drove from Sudbury," she said. "I would have called, but I wasn't sure you'd answer." She glanced at the grocery bag, then back at his face. "Could we come in for a moment?" He let them in. The apartment looked exactly like what it was, a place where someone was getting by. There were library books on every flat surface. Zoe's puzzle was still spread across the kitchen table, half finished. There was a pot on the stove from dinner. On the fridge, held up with a moose-shaped magnet, was a drawing Zoe had made of the two of them standing in front of a house that didn't look like any place they'd ever lived. A big house with a red door and a tree out front. The way children draw the houses they imagine rather than the ones they know. Zoe emerged from the hallway in her pajamas, still awake, saw 2 strangers in the kitchen and froze. "Hey Bug," Adrian said. "Go get your moose and wait in your room for a few minutes, okay?" Zoe looked at the woman in the gray coat with the focused appraisal of a child who misses nothing. Then she looked at the boy. Then she looked at her father. "Okay," she said, and disappeared. The boy watched the hallway. She'd gone down with an expression that was hard to read. Catherine sat down at the kitchen table, moving a library book gently to the side, and Adrian sat across from her because there was nothing else to do. "I read the resignation letter you sent," she said. Don would have told you. Don didn't tell me anything, she said. I found it because I've been doing quarterly reviews of departure paperwork for the past 2 years. I started doing it after we lost 4 experienced workers in 1 year. All voluntary resignations. All from men and women dealing with family situations the company had no framework to support. She set her hands flat on the table. I should have done it years earlier. Adrian waited. Your letter wasn't angry, she said. Most of them are. Yours just explained what happened. It said you had worked for 11 years and were proud of the work, and that you were leaving because your daughter needed you and there was no other option. She paused. That last part stayed with me. The boy shifted in his chair. Catherine glanced at him, and something moved across her face, not quite a softness but something close to it. This is my son Freddie, she said. He asked to come. Adrian looked at the boy. Freddie was looking at the fridge, at the drawing with the red door and the tree out front.
I've been running this company for 31 years,
Catherine said. I was back at my desk 9 days after Freddie was born. I thought that was what strength looked like. She said it without drama, plainly, the way someone states a fact they've had a long time to come to terms with. Freddie's father raised him, mostly. He did a wonderful job, but there were things I missed that I will not get back, and I understood that much later than I should have. Freddie was still looking at the drawing. He hadn't said anything yet. A few months ago, Catherine continued, Freddie told me something. He said that when he was small, he used to think that my work must be more important than he was, because I always chose it first. She stopped. He wasn't angry when he said it. That was the part that was difficult to hear. He had just accepted it the way children do. The apartment was very quiet. Outside, the last of the April snow was coming down in a thin, half-hearted way, not really committing to being winter anymore. Adrian thought about Zoe asking him if they had enough. He thought about her voice, not worried, just asking, making sure he knew she was paying attention. Why did you come here? He said, not unkindly. Just genuinely wanting to understand. Because I've spent 2 years redesigning our HR structure and I needed someone to help me implement it, Catherine said. And because when I read your letter, I thought, here is someone who understood something about priorities that took me 3 decades to figure out. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and pulled out a folded document, setting it on the table between them. I'm not offering you your old position. He looked at the document, but didn't pick it up yet. What I'm offering is a new role. Family Liaison Coordinator. It's a position I'm building into the regional structure. Your job would be to work directly with employees navigating caregiving situations. Flexible scheduling, partly remote, full benefits. She tapped the corner of the document. Full benefits includes coverage for Zoe's continued physiotherapy. Adrian picked up the document then. He read the first page carefully. He was the kind of person who read things carefully, which is why it took him a moment, before he got to the handwritten note paper clipped to the back. Catherine's handwriting was small and even. 11 years without a single file complaint, and a resignation letter that had no bitterness in it. That's not nothing. Come help me build something that should have existed 20 years ago. He set the pages down, on the table. Freddie had finally stopped looking at the drawing on the fridge. He was watching Adrian now, with an expression that was composed but not quite neutral. The look of a teenager who has thought very carefully about whether he wanted to be in this room and decided in the end that he did. She really did change things, Freddie said. It was the first time he'd spoken. His voice was quieter than Adrian expected. I know it doesn't fix the years before, but she did. Adrian didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about what it meant for a 15-year-old to say something like that. Not as reassurance, not to make an adult feel better, but as something he had apparently worked out for himself and decided was true. Can I get you something? Adrian said finally. I was going to make tea. Catherine looked mildly surprised. Then she said yes, that would be fine. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove, and a minute later Zoe reappeared in the doorway, holding her stuffed moose, having waited about as long as a 7-year-old with good hearing could reasonably be expected to wait. She looked at Freddie. Do you want to see the puzzle? She asked. It's Canada. I already found British Columbia, but Alberta keeps falling out. Freddie looked at her for a second, then at the half-finished map on the table. Sure, he said. The kettle was still heating when Adrian looked over and saw his daughter showing Catherine Norwood's son where Saskatchewan was, explaining with great authority that the border between provinces was decided because of something to do with farming, which he was fairly sure was not accurate, but chose not to correct. He turned back to the stove. The folder was still on the table beside the puzzle. He had not said yes yet, and Catherine had not pressed him, which told him something about her that the letter alone hadn't. He thought about 11 years of early mornings and late calls, and driving out to work sites in February ice. He thought about Zoe in the hospital bed, her small face very calm, holding his hand before they took her into surgery. He thought about her asking, "Do we have enough?" and answering with "We'll be okay," and the small, serious way she had looked at him and said, "I know, I just wanted to make sure you knew." The kettle began to whistle. He thought about what it means to choose the harder thing, not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because it is the true thing, and how rarely anyone gets to see that choice return to them in any form at all. How it is not something you can count on. How it is grace, when it comes, and not a reward. Because if it were a reward it would mean the people who never get it somehow deserve that too. And that was not a world Adrian was willing to believe in. He poured the tea. "I'll need a few days to read through everything properly," he said, bringing the mugs to the table. "Of course," Catherine said. Zoe had found Alberta, and was pressing it firmly into place with 2 thumbs, narrating under her breath. Freddie was watching with an expression that had something in it Adrian recognized. The look of someone who is unexpectedly comfortable. Somewhere they did not expect to be comfortable. Adrian sat back down. He wrapped both hands around his mug, and looked at the folder, and then at his daughter, and then out the window at the snow that was finally stopping. Outside, the street lamps were coming on one by one in the early dark, and the city was going quiet the way Canadian cities go quiet in April. Not the stillness of winter, but something different. Something that carries the first low suggestion of a different season coming. Not warmth yet, just the possibility of it. Sometimes the bravest thing a person does is not the dramatic thing. Sometimes it's just pressing send on a letter and walking home through the cold to make oatmeal. And trusting that something in the universe is keeping track. Not to reward you, but because the truth of what you did doesn't disappear just because no one saw it. Zoe finished Saskatchewan and looked up at him across the table with her serious dark eyes. "We're almost done," she said. "Yeah," Adrian said. "I think we are."